Most people assume that economic power lies in the hands of presidents, prime ministers, or CEOs of famous multinational companies. But what if the real control comes from networks so invisible that even policymakers only glimpse their outlines? And what if these networks weren't created through conspiracy or collusion, but through decades of decisions, treaties, and market forces that slowly concentrated power into fewer and fewer hands? To answer that mystery, we need to trace the hidden architecture that shapes everything from the price of bread to the stability of nations. Our story begins after World War II, when the world desperately needed reconstruction, stability, and a way to prevent the economic chaos that had fueled global conflict. Nations gathered at Bretton Woods to design a financial order grounded in cooperation. On the surface, it seemed like a triumph of diplomacy, but beneath the ideals lay the foundations of a network that would steadily grow more powerful than the governments that created it. The creation of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank introduced the first major layer. These institutions were designed to regulate economic stability and provide development funding, but their operations required deep coordination with central banks, finance ministries, and private institutions. This created an early global network, one built on loans, policy conditions, and surveillance of national economies. Meanwhile, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the precursor to the World Trade Organization, began reducing barriers and integrating markets. As countries embraced free trade, multinational corporations gained the ability to move capital, labor, and production across borders more freely than governments could control. This shift paved the way for private economic entities to grow more powerful than many nation-states. By the 1960s, a dense web of corporate, financial, and political relationships had formed. But the real turning point came when the United States ended the gold standard in 1971. Freed from the constraints of physical reserves, the financial system transitioned into a structure where currency values depended not on gold, but on trust, and trust was influenced by institutions, rating agencies, and speculative markets that operated far beyond public scrutiny. This transition allowed financial markets to expand rapidly. Banks became global players. Corporations gained access to massive capital flows, and currency traders acquired influence that could destabilize entire nations. The global economy now depended on systems that few people understood, and even fewer could influence. As the 1980s began, deregulation swept across advanced economies. The belief was simple: markets regulate themselves better than governments can. This idea opened the gates for financial innovation. Hedge funds, leveraged buyouts, and complex investment vehicles that connected markets across continents. Instead of national economies acting independently, they became nodes in a sprawling financial network. This network expanded even further when technology advanced. Computerized trading, global communication systems, and integrated data flows allowed money to move across borders in milliseconds. Investors in New York could affect interest rates in Malaysia, while a currency fluctuation in London could reshape trade deals in Africa. Power no longer belonged to states alone. It belonged to the institutions that managed and manipulated these flows. Corporate consolidation added another layer. As megacorporations merged, a small number of companies began to control essential global sectors: food, energy, media, pharmaceuticals, and finance. Today, just a handful of firms handle most of the world's shipping, data storage, credit card transactions, and commodity trading. This concentrated control quietly shapes supply chains and influences government decisions without public awareness. The 1990s introduced a new twist. Globalization seemed unstoppable, but it also created vulnerabilities. The Asian financial crisis revealed how quickly capital could flee a region, collapsing currencies, destroying savings, and triggering massive unemployment. Seemingly local problems were amplified through international networks of lending, speculation, and capital mobility. As governments intervened, they discovered that their ability to control their own economic destiny was limited. They needed the cooperation of global investors, international institutions, and rating agencies, entities that were unelected, transnational, and insulated from public pressure. The invisible network tightened. Then came the 2008 financial crisis, which exposed just how interconnected and fragile the system had become. Mortgage-backed securities created in the United States were sold globally, entangling European banks, Asian investors, and pension funds everywhere. When the system collapsed, governments had to step in with trillions in bailouts. But the institutions responsible for the crisis remained intact and often emerged even larger. This moment reinforced the reality that economic power was no longer distributed, but concentrated. A few financial institutions were declared too big to fail, meaning their collapse would destabilize the world. This designation effectively granted them immunity, solidifying their role at the top of the global network. As the dust settled, central banks took on unprecedented roles. They slashed interest rates, bought government bonds, and injected liquidity into the financial system. These actions stabilized markets, but they also shifted enormous power to central bankers and elected officials whose decisions affected global employment, inflation, and wealth distribution. Meanwhile, the digital revolution was reshaping economic power again. Tech giants emerged with influence greater than many nations. They controlled data, algorithms, communication channels, and digital infrastructure. Their platforms became essential to global commerce, and their networks reached billions of users across every continent. These tech firms didn't just join the global network. Became central nodes. With access to vast amounts of personal, financial, and behavioral data, they gained insights and influence that even governments struggled to match. Algorithms determined market behavior, consumer decisions, and political discussions, reinforcing an invisible architecture of control. Simultaneously, investment funds grew at an unprecedented rate. Asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street accumulated trillions in assets. Their ownership stakes spanned thousands of corporations, meaning they indirectly influence global industries, corporate governance, and long-term strategic decisions. A tiny number of firms now hold silent sway over the global economy. In developing countries, the network manifests differently. International lenders, global supply chains, and foreign corporations shape economic policy and labor markets. Infrastructure projects often depend on external financing, giving lenders political leverage. Local economies become dependent on decisions made far beyond their borders. Even geopolitical strategies are tied to this network. Countries use investment incentives, trade routes, and currency manipulation to exert influence. The Belt and Road Initiative, for example, connects dozens of nations through infrastructure and financing, but also embeds them deeper into global debt networks that extend far beyond traditional diplomacy. Despite these changes, attempts to reform the system repeatedly fail. Regulations are introduced after crises, but powerful lobbies, complex financial innovations, and political resistance dilute reforms over time. Each crisis produces promises of change, yet the core structure remains intact and often grows even stronger. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated concentration even further. Lockdowns pushed consumers toward digital platforms, boosting tech giants. Governments borrowed trillions, increasing dependence on central banks and global investors. Supply chains centralized around dominant firms with the capacity to endure disruptions. The network became not only invisible but unavoidable. Today, the world economy is governed less by national policy than by interactions among corporations, banks, algorithms, international institutions, and investment funds. These networks are invisible not because they are secret, but because they are complex, spanning borders, industries, and digital systems that ordinary citizens never see. The unsettling truth is that the concentration of economic power, ISNT, the result of a single design, it is the consequence of decades of choices that prioritized efficiency over resilience, growth over fairness, and financial integration over local stability. Each decision strengthened the networks that now shape global prosperity and vulnerability. Most citizens experience the effects of these networks in subtle ways: rising living costs, stagnant wages, limited competition, data surveillance, and reduced political influence. People sense that something is wrong, but the mechanics remain hidden behind jargon, institutions, and systems too vast to visualize. As we move deeper into the 21st century, the concentration of economic power continues to expand through automation, artificial intelligence, and digital finance. Whoever controls the data, algorithms, and capital flows will shape the future trajectory of nations and societies. The invisible networks are evolving, and their influence is becoming more absolute. The first takeaway is that economic power today is not distributed vertically from government to citizen but horizontally across transnational networks that operate beyond traditional oversight. Understanding these structures reveals how modern decisions are shaped. The second takeaway is that crises do not break these networks. They reinforce them. Each collapse strengthens the institutions that survive, increasing their dominance and deepening dependency. The third takeaway is that citizens and policymakers must rethink how economic systems are governed, demanding transparency, competition, and resilience. Instead of blindly trusting invisible mechanisms that concentrate power, the future remains uncertain. But one truth is clear: ignoring these unseen networks will only widen inequalities and weaken democratic influence. Recognizing their role is the first step toward shaping a more balanced and equitable global economy. If you want to understand not just how the world economy works, but who truly influences it, stay curious, stay informed, and keep exploring the hidden webs that shape your financial reality.